This is going to be a non-professional amateur view based on my hobby, which has been bird watching for something like 50 years in Berkshire, in Oxfordshire now. It would be pretty boring if every time I went out I just saw the same birds. The interest is quite often that I go out and see something different. It might be because it's a different time of year, a different weather. But over the years, almost everything seems to have changed. Lots of birds have come new. Lots of birds that I knew as a lad or as a student have almost disappeared. So this is my sort of experience and my thoughts about why all this has happened. Let's give you an example. First of all, collared dove. There are plenty of them about now as a garden bird. Most of you probably have come across them at some stage. They were unknown in this country in 1950. The first breeding pairs were in 1955. Some of the bird watchers even older than me, like Bill Oddie, travelled vast distances to see collared dove because it was brand new. And in fact, prior to the Second World War, they were pretty much restricted to southern Eastern Europe, and their numbers suddenly expanded. And they're virtually everywhere in this country now, right up into the outer Isles of Scotland. And I've got absolutely no idea why, and nor has anybody else. It just happened. So any explanation I give you for why birds have changed, it's probably only a partial explanation. I don't go very far now. My days of rushing around the country have greatly reduced, and most of my bird watching is done on foot, walking from home. So what can I tell you about changes in the UK or even further afield based on walking around my parish in Benson? Well, the birds I see travelled a lot further than me. There was a report last autumn of a bird that set off from Alaska, a wading bird. It flew non-stop for 10 days, travelled 8,000 miles, and ended up in Australia, which was the wrong place, so it took off and flew to New Zealand. We know that because that bird was carrying a satellite tag, and so they could see it as it travelled. And we're doing, or the professionals are doing this with birds as small as cuckoo or even smaller than that now. So we know, for example, where the cuckoos spend their winter. And of course, even walking around here, some of the birds you see quite probably have come hundreds, if not thousands of miles to be here. The robins you see in your garden today, probably not the same ones you're going to see in May. The ones you see in your garden today may well have spent the summer in Scandinavia or Eastern Europe. The ones you saw last summer are probably down in the Mediterranean somewhere. It's very difficult to actually know whether you're seeing the same bird or a different one, but I'll give you an example later on. And as I walk round, I'm seeing birds that have spent the summer in Africa, swallows almost to the southern end of Africa. I'm seeing at the moment thrushes that have come in from Scandinavia. I'm seeing small birds in my garden that probably bred somewhere in Germany or further east even than that at the moment. There's been, at the moment, quite an influx of ducks from America, and the really keen bird watchers are rushing around. There's an American kingfisher near Preston. There's a rare American duck somewhere off Edinburgh. There are several rare American ducks down in Devon. These birds quite often will return year after year. In other words, they're making the commute across the Atlantic in the autumn, going back in the spring. What changes the numbers? Why are I seeing different birds at different times as the years go by? The biggest one possibly in terms of numbers is farming changes. Farming is much more efficient. There's less grain spilt when combining. There are fewer weeds. There are fewer pests attacking the crops. Great for farming, not so good for birds because it takes away food. Fortunately, farmers now are beginning to adapt the way they farm, making more room for wildlife and birds, and hopefully that trend will continue. Then, of course, we've got land development. We all know about new housing estates, new infrastructure, new roads, new railways, and new buildings on green fields offer less in the way of opportunities for birds to nest and feed. Well, I was very pleased we have some new houses in Brampton, and I was very pleased last year to see that the starlings had moved into one of those houses before the people had. I don't think that was an intentional piece of ecological management. It was just poor building. And then we'll also talk about conservation. Land use development, that includes things like quarries. And that might seem something pretty horrible in terms of reducing bird numbers, but the old gravel pits in the Thames Valley have turned into some pretty remarkable reserves for birds. This is Dinton Pastures on the edge of Wokingham, mainly for, I suppose, for fishing and sailing, but it's actually a very good place for birds, and lots of rarities turn up, as well as lots of new breeding species. Some of the fields that were there before the gravel pits were dug, probably much worse for bird diversity than the gravel pits that now remain. So it's not always a bad thing that land use changes. We're also, in this country, very much at the top of the tree in terms of conservation efforts. The RSPB's got over 1 million members. Wildfowl and Wetland Trust has got another 800,000. Then you've got all the local nature reserves. There's over 2,300 local nature reserves around the country. And then there are all the local initiatives like Hope Copse. So there's a lot gone on in conservation in terms of preserving and improving habitats, places for birds to nest, to feed, to spend the winter. And above and beyond that, there have been efforts to repair some of the damage done to birds by humans over the years. Red kites were shot out of existence and lived only in very small numbers in mid-Wales. In the 1950s, every red kite in this country could trace its heritage, well, they all came from one female. Okay, there was just one fertile female red kite in this country. And the whole population stemmed from that one bird until a wanderer from Germany turned up sometime in the 1970s. They started reintroducing red kites, including very close to where we live in Benson, and there are now thousands of them, spreading well across the country. They survive because nobody shoots them. And the conservation bodies have done very well in preventing or dissuading people from shooting birds of prey. But because they're not shooting birds of prey, other things are moving in, like raven. We never saw ravens when I first lived in Oxfordshire back in the early 70s. I remember going with Peggy to see a pair in North Oxfordshire specifically. We drove some way to see them. They now fly over our garden from time to time. So these birds have come back as a result of conservation and attitudes to birds being better. Of course, sometimes things aren't entirely deliberate. Rose-ring parakeets or ringneck parakeets, you can choose whichever name you like, are now spreading quite widely mainly from Western London, spreading out along the Thames, and they may well be in a garden near you very soon. And they're escapes. They came, allegedly, from the film set of The African Queen, which was filmed in film studios. I think it was Pinewood in South London. They got out. So while Humphrey Bogart was doing his stuff on the film set, these so-and-sos were escaping and spreading around the country. And very noisy they are too. They don't seem to affect anything else, so the conservationists have left them alone. There was another escapee called the ruddy duck, which did get out, and that has been culled more or less out of existence in this country because of concerns about it doing harm to existing species. The main talk I'm supposed to be talking about is climate change and why things are changing due to climate. First thing to say is, it depends what time of year you're talking about. The winters we're going to get now look set to become warmer and wetter, although this one's been a bit dry. If you're a bird that winters in the frozen north of Russia, in the taiga or the tundra, you're not going to survive up there through a very cold Siberian winter. So you migrate. And you migrate to somewhere where you can survive. Lots of birds used to come right the way down to the UK. I'm seeing very many less of those now. And the reason is because it's warmer, closer to their breeding ground. Why fly all this way? If I can survive without flying that extra distance, then in the spring in particular, I get back sooner, and that gives me an advantage as a breeding bird. So as the years go by, the number of breeding birds that travel to the UK decreases. One of the examples is the goldeneye. It's a bird I used to see on local gravel pits in Oxfordshire every year without fail. I haven't seen one for 2 or 3 years now in North Oxfordshire. In South Oxfordshire, they've just disappeared entirely. Goldeneye, James Bond, is the name of the house lived in by Ian Fleming. He was a bird watcher, and one of his friends wrote a book on the birds of the West Indies where the estate goldeneye is. And the name of that bird watcher who wrote the book? James Bond. And it's not only we're seeing less of certain species in winter, we're seeing others that have followed the same sort of general rule. If I can spend the winter closer to where I breed, I'm going to do better than if I travel further. So we're now seeing some species that used to fly from the Russian tundra, taiga. They used to fly across the Himalayas to winter in India. Okay? We're now beginning to see them turn up in the UK. Chiffchaff is a common breeding bird in the UK. Some of those local birds now don't bother to go south for the winter. They can survive all winter in the UK. Quite often, it must be said, at sewage farms, where there's a year-long supply of insects. But they're being joined by this sort of washed-out individual. That should be green, and it isn't. And that's a sign that it's actually the Siberian race of chiffchaff that we're now seeing coming in. What about summer? Well, they say we're going to have warmer summers and critically drier summers. The net result is that we've got fewer insects flying about. And therefore, birds that need huge numbers of insect to feed their young as they're coming up suddenly find there's less food. So they're moving to places where there are more insects. There's not much point coming up here if you're a swallow and you've spent the winter in South Africa, unless there's some good reason for flying all that distance and coming to the UK. And the reason is, or was, the number of insects available. Okay? The other thing, of course, is, Mike said something about a global view of the effects on birds of climate change. Some of the species that used to be very common are now getting very rare, and it's not necessarily due to what's happening in this country. There are land use changes and climate changes where they spend the winter. So cuckoos, for example, are in an area where the habitat is changing and reducing. When I first came across this concept, it was in the mid-60s, a species called common whitethroat that used to be, as it sounds, common, 1 year just didn't come back. Hardly any of them came back. It was eventually pinned down to a drought in the Sahel, south of the Sahara. They just not survived the winter because of the drought. So we see, we see that what we see locally depends on land use changes, in farming changes, in climate changes, not just here, but across the world almost. Some other species, because it's nicer and warmer and more like France now here than it used to be, are beginning to extend their range further north. So we're seeing new birds turn up. This is willow warbler, very much like chiffchaff. Used to be a very, very common breeding bird. In fact, as a lad, I was told that this was the commonest UK summer visitor. There are more of these turning up in summer than any other species. The last couple of years, I've hardly seen one at all in summer in South Oxfordshire. They've virtually disappeared. I hope what's happening is that they're going further north on migration where there are more insects. But they've become totally different in numbers. But we're getting some replacements. This is firecrest. It's one of the smallest British birds. It's hardly the size of a wren. They've extended up. When I was a student at Reading, if you were really in the know and knew the right people, they would tell you where to go into the New Forest to look for breeding firecrests. It was a pretty awful thing to do because they're that big and they live in Douglas firs about 20 metres up. So unless you've got a very strong neck, you never saw them properly anyway. Nowadays, they're in the woods in the Chilterns between here and Oxfordshire in pretty large numbers and all year. Complete new species for us in many ways. And there's another species that's increasing, something called a Mediterranean gull. Well, pretty obvious that it didn't used to be here and it used to be in the Mediterranean, I suppose. This individual bird actually came from a nest in Serbia and is now spending its summers breeding in a colony in Belgium, and it spends its winter in Weymouth. And we know all that because of the ring on its leg, YA22, white on red. Oh, sorry, it's YAAZ actually. And because we can photograph that, send in the details, I ended up having an email conversation with the chap in Serbia who actually ringed it as a youngster and sent him that picture of one of his birds much later on. What about the sea? There's not much change. There's a bit in fishing, but it's only very local. There's not much change in sea use. Okay, wind farms are a bit of a nuisance at sea for birds. But generally speaking, the main obvious changes in birds, when you're talking about maritime birds, is climate change. Puffins live on sand eels, that's what they feed their young, and sand eels are moving further north as the waters get warmer because they don't like the warm water. And so the puffins are moving north. They used to be seen every time I went on holiday in Weymouth. Now we struggle to see one. But in exchange, we're seeing new birds, things we'd never find in the book. Have a look at Mike's book. You will not find red-billed tropic bird. It's not terribly difficult to guess where it comes from, given the names. It actually, until recently, was a rare wanderer in Florida, despite breeding in the Caribbean. And yet it's now turned up off the Cornish coast. And another species, similar thing, and then tropical species is now turning up, is the wonderfully named brown booby. And they are now turning up on the south coast of the UK. All right. It's called brown booby because it's largely brown on top. All right. Thanks.